I am absolutely thrilled to welcome members of this audience, many online, and wonderful to see many here in person as well, to Eradicating Barriers to Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls, a CSW70 parallel event. My name is Dorchen Leitholt, and I am the Senior Director of Sanctuary for Families Center for Battered Women's Legal Services. We come together today to confront the staggeringly disproportionate rates of gender-based violence inflicted on Indigenous women and girls around the world, and the systemic barriers they struggle to overcome in efforts to achieve safety and justice. Our guides in this urgently needed conversation are 4 gender justice experts and leaders, 3 of whom are themselves Indigenous women. Before I introduce our speakers, a heartfelt thanks to the law firm of Covington and Burling for welcoming us so generously in this magnificent space with all of our needs provided for, and lunch is in the adjoining room. And to lead organizer Lynn Hyman, the administrator of Sanctuary's Legal Center. And we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Lenape people, known as Lenapehoking. We recognize the history of displacement and colonization that removed Indigenous peoples from this land, and we honor Lenape and other Indigenous communities who remain connected to this place today. We offer this acknowledgement with respect and a commitment to continue learning about Indigenous histories and supporting Indigenous communities. Our panelists are, and if each panelist would just stand briefly so you know who our wonderful panelists are. You may figure it out from their photographs. I'm going to name them alphabetically, and start with Ruchira Gupta, who is the founder president of Upney Up Women Worldwide, an Emmy Award-winning journalist. You don't have to stand the whole time, Ruchira, but thank you so much. By the way, everybody already knows you, not necessary. An Emmy Award-winning journalist for the groundbreaking documentary, The Selling of Innocence. Ruchira has pioneered gender-sensitive interventions to end intergenerational prostitution among denotified tribes in India's Bihar, Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, and West Bengal. She has helped introduce and shape anti-trafficking policies and laws across the globe, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States and the Indian anti-trafficking law. Ruchira is an award-winning author of young adult novels that educate and prevent domestic violence. You'll see them here, I Kick and I Fly, and The Freedom Seeker. And I just wanted to point out that Hira, the protagonist of I Kick and I Fly, is a young Indigenous trafficking survivor, and it's an extraordinary journey that she is on. Although these are young adult novels, everyone is reading them, regardless of age. I'm thrilled to introduce Rita Cassé, an Indigenous Yoruba leader who is the founder and executive director of the Yoruba Anina Civil Society, a non-governmental organization that advocates for the rights and safety and survival of the Yoruba people, an Indigenous minority community in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Working in the high conflict region of Tigray and in refugee resettlement camps in Sudan, Rita has a special focus on the rights and safety of Indigenous Yoruba Tigrayan women who have survived sexual assault in conflict. She is the co-author of Plain Sight, a book documenting sexual violence against Tigrayan women and the struggle for justice for Tigrayan survivors. The Honorable Melissa Pope, and whom you can, I believe, see perhaps. I don't know if Judge Pope is visible yet, serves as the chief judge of the Natuasipi Huron Band of the Potawatomi Tribal Court, where she has been consistently reappointed by Tribal Council since 2011. Judge Pope has also served in the elected position of Chief Judge of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians Tribal Court of Appeals since 2009. We are so honored to have Judge Pope join us. She teaches American Indian law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. She's been a longstanding advocate to end violence against women through work with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center, the Women's Forum, and Take Back the Night. And finally, among our panelists, Faith Robles is an Indigenous Mayan human trafficking survivor and advocate who has served on the PACT, Preventing Access to Child Trafficking, Survivors Council since 2020. A survivor of child trafficking, Faith played a critical role in providing the U.S. government with the evidence it needed to successfully prosecute a Mexican sex trafficking organized crime group that victimized countless numbers of young women. In 2019, she helped found a nonprofit, Dahlia's Hope, a Utah-based nonprofit that provides comprehensive, trauma-informed aftercare for survivors of sex trafficking. And I would like to introduce our moderators. A few introductions, and our moderators are themselves extraordinary experts. Jessica Wind Abalafia is the Senior Program Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families. She provides direct representation and oversees a team of attorneys and case managers who provide trauma-informed legal and supportive services for domestic and immigrant survivors of human trafficking and co-occurring forms of gender-based violence. Jessica and her team also advocate for legislative and policy changes that further the rights of trafficking survivors. Next to Jessica is Nihat Amare, a senior immigration specialist in Sanctuary for Families Immigration Intervention Project, where she has fought for the rights of immigrant survivors for over 7 years at Sanctuary for Families. And prior to that, and many of those survivors have been Indigenous. Prior to that, for over 12 years, Nihat advanced the legal needs of African immigrants at the African Services Committee, a nonprofit here in New York City. She is a passionate advocate for the rights of Tigrayan women, especially those who have suffered sexual violence in the conflict in Ethiopia. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Simone Monasabian, who will be providing opening remarks today. Simone is the Chief Program Officer for Sanctuary for Families, where she oversees its work on gender-based violence, protection, and prevention. Previously, Simone was the director of the New York office at the New York office of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, strengthening the office's focus on gender-based violence. Prior to that, Simone prosecuted war crimes, many gender-based, as trial attorney with the Office of the Prosecutor at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and as principal defender at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And Simone will now take the floor.
Thank you so much, Dorchen. Good morning. Sanctuary for Families is so honored to co-organize this event with PACT, APNI App, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, such amazing partners. And we're honored to have so many colleagues, advocates, and leaders who are committed to advancing justice for Indigenous women and girls around the world here with us today. Our conversation today is closely aligned with the priority theme of this year's United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which is access to justice for women and girls. The theme highlights a fundamental reality in advancing gender equality. The existence of laws alone does not guarantee justice. Around the world, women and girls continue to face barriers when seeking protection, accountability, and remedies for violations of their rights. Those barriers may include poverty, discrimination, geographic isolation, lack of representation, language barriers, stigma, and fear of retaliation. For many survivors of violence, exploitation, and trafficking, the justice system feels distant, inaccessible, and unsafe. From a human rights perspective, access to justice is not simply about whether laws exist. It is about whether individuals and communities can meaningfully exercise their rights safely and without discrimination, and whether institutions are equipped to respond in ways that are fair, accessible, and culturally responsive. Organizations that provide direct legal services to survivors play a critical role in bridging the gap between legal protection and lived reality. Sanctuary for Families is one of the leading service providers in the United States for survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and gender-based violence. Through its legal services programs, Sanctuary provides free legal representation to women and girls seeking orders of protection, immigration relief, family law remedies, and other legal protections enabling survivors to rebuild their lives safely. And these legal services are holistically complemented by access to economic empowerment programs, shelter, and counseling. This year marks Sanctuary's 5th year participating in events during the CSW, joining civil society organizations, governments, Indigenous leaders, and human rights advocates from around the world to share knowledge and advance global commitments to gender equality and justice. My own work on these issues has been shaped by my many years addressing human trafficking as well as transnational and atrocity crimes. During my decades at the UN, I worked with governments, prosecutors, law enforcement partners, and civil society members from Indigenous communities to strengthen and reform criminal legal system responses to trafficking in persons and other forms of exploitation. A good part of that work was in partnership with the organizations who are our co-organizers here today. Pursuing justice for vulnerable populations at the UN very much reinforced how important it is to ensure that justice systems must not only be strong on paper, they must be accessible to the people who need them most. Today's panel focuses on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the particular barriers Indigenous women and girls face when seeking justice. Globally, there are approximately 476 million Indigenous people across more than 90 countries, representing just over 6% of the world's population. Yet Indigenous people account for nearly 19% of those living in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank. Indigenous peoples are communities with historical continuity to societies that exist prior to colonization. They maintain distinct languages, cultural traditions, systems of governance, and relationships to ancestral lands and territories. For many Indigenous communities, land is not simply an economic resource. It is central to identity, spirituality, cultural continuity, and collective survival. The rights of Indigenous peoples are recognized in international human rights law, including in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These rights include the right to self-determination, the right to maintain cultural traditions and languages, the right to control traditional lands and natural resources, and the right to participate meaningfully in decisions affecting their communities. For Indigenous women and girls, these rights are deeply connected to the ability to live free from violence and discrimination. Across many regions of the world, Indigenous women experience disproportionately high rates of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. They may face barriers to reporting abuse, including geographic isolation, lack of culturally appropriate services, language barriers, and distrust of institutions rooted in historical injustices. Access to justice, therefore, must be understood broadly. It means access to safe reporting mechanisms and survivor-centered services. access to legal representation and remedies, justice systems that are culturally competent and geographically accessible, and recognition and respect for Indigenous sovereignty and legal traditions. Ultimately, access to justice must ensure that Indigenous women and girls are able not only to seek protection when harm occurs, but also to exercise their rights as leaders, decision makers, and defenders of their communities and lands. Justice is not only procedural, it is structural, and advancing it requires sustained commitment, partnership, and accountability from the institutions and advocates represented here today. Thank you for being part of this important conversation and for your continued commitment towards ensuring that Indigenous women and girls are able to fully exercise their rights and access justice.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Dorchen. And thank you to all of you who are here attending this event, both virtually and in person. We are so grateful for your interest in this truly important topic. And in particular, Niet and I are so grateful and honored to have the privilege of moderating a panel of such extraordinary women and activists. And now we'll be turning to our panel. And we would like to invite each of you to talk about yourselves, the communities you work with, and the work that brings you to this conversation, beginning with the Honorable Melissa Pope, please. Okay. Faith, would you please introduce yourself, the community you work with, and the work that brings you to this conversation?
Thank you. Absolutely. It's such an honor for me to be part of this panel, and also something that has brought me to this. My name is Faith Robles. I am from Chiapas, Mexico. English is my third language. I have been member of the Survivors Council with PACT since 2020. And something that I noticed is the lack of resources for Indigenous survivors like myself.
Thank you, Faith. Rita Kasai. If you would like to introduce yourself, the community that you work with, and the work that brings you to this conversation this morning.
Thank you so much. A real honor. My name is Rita. Of minority Ethiopia. I'm Janae by background, but since the mass destruction of the region,
Rita, we're having a bit of a hard time hearing you. We'll just give it a few minutes. Maybe you've lost some connection. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. So Rita is currently in Ethiopia, East Africa, all the way a few hours away. And I think the internet connection might be our issue, though I don't think it's hers. She's saying I'm connected. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But just so that I give context that she is 8 hours away now and time zone wise, and she's in Ethiopia. That might be an additional factor.
We apologize for the technical issues. Turning to Rashira, can you please describe to us a little bit about your work, who you are, and the work that brings you to the conversation this morning?
Thank you all. It's just so wonderful to be in this room with many people I recognize as fellow activists over the years. I'm Ruchira. I'm an activist from India. I began my journey as a journalist, making a documentary on missing girls from Nepal who were trafficked to the brothels of Mumbai. And the experience of making the documentary sort of took me further than just presenting the documentary. I wanted to do something for the women and girls I had interviewed and met. Some of them at that time in Mumbai actually on display in cages. And I used the documentary and the platform it gave me to go to Mumbai and set up an NGO called Apne Aap, which means self action in Hindi, with the 22 women in prostitution who I had interviewed for the documentary. And while making the documentary, they had saved my life by actually surrounding me when a man tried to pull out a knife and try to kill me when I was filming. And these women said, "No, we want to tell our story, so you'll have to kill us first." So I understood the power of women's collective action in that moment. And that became the organizing principle of Apne Aap, where we organized women into small groups and then federated into larger groups. And our main aim was to break the cycle of intergenerational prostitution, something that we saw among Dalit communities known as Devadasis, and also among indigenous communities who were formerly nomadic groups. And under British colonialism, they had been labeled as criminal tribes because they resisted being leaving their forests behind, which the British wanted for timber and other things for the First and Second World Wars. But also these groups were told they could not make products because they had to be replaced by made in England products. And they were labeled as criminals, not allowed to move, not allowed to wear shoes, ride on horses, wear hats, own houses. And they got so marginalized that they became squatters in either government land or the land of landlords known as zamindars in India. And slowly they were forced into pimping and providing their women to government authorities and to these landlords. And they forgot who they were before this, and prostitution became intergenerational in such tribes. And Apne Aap decided that along with working in Mumbai, we would go into these settlements, these tribal settlements. They're caste ghettos, really, and open community centers, and organize the women and girls there. First, as a safe space, second, as a community classroom, and a third as a place to access legal justice, because they were not just invisible, they were actually deliberately oppressed and kept out of all systems. Like they could not, if they would go to a police station, they would be told, "Oh, you're pimps and prostitutes and thieves." If they went to a school, they would be told to sit on the last bench, or not even admitted into schools. And so Apne Aap for 30 years now has been doing advocacy and providing safe spaces among such groups and organizing them to access justice, change laws. We've put 64 traffickers in jail and also got into parliament to change laws. And some of the kids that we ran community classrooms for went to school and college and have their own lives and did break the cycle of intergenerational prostitution. One of those young women is here right now from India, attending the CSW, Shweta Khatti. And she went to Bard College here, and now she runs an NGO called Kranti, which is a home for trafficked kids.
Thank you, Rashira. Rita, we'll come back to you now. Would you please introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Thank you. I hope you guys can hear me better now.
Yes.
It's
Thank you.
It's
Yes.
an honor to be part of this conversation. I was saying my name is Rita Kahsai. I am an Indigenous woman from Tigray in northern Ethiopia, and I'm an engineer by background. But I came into this work through the destruction that started in November 2020 in our region. And from then, I became an advocate that works on justice and accountability in relation to mass atrocities and conflict-related sexual violence, to try to support women attain justice, not just women, but other members of the community as well. Our work is rooted in, well, firstly, my own experience, but if as well as the experiences of other Tigrayans. If you know any Tigrayans, that if you know any Tigrayans in the diaspora or anywhere really, every single Tigrayan has lost a family member to this conflict that began in November 2020. So it's to speak to that. And my advocacy began initially in the diaspora. I grew up in the UK, and then because it was one of the world's longest communications blackouts in Tigray back then, I moved to Sudan, where we had the biggest access to victims, where I spent a year documenting the experiences of individuals displaced by conflict. And this work included the experiences of Indigenous Irobs and other Tigrayans, many of whom had survived extreme forms of violence, family separation, and destruction to the systems, especially like health systems, that were created to protect them through the work in Sudan. I co-authored a book called In Plain Sight, and it's a book on conflict-related sexual violence and the destructive nature of it in the region. This book is available online, and all the money from this book goes to survivors, should you be interested to learn more. But yeah, so since then I moved to Tigray, where I am currently living, and as part of my work with Irobanina, which means Irob Existence, the name of our organization, we've spent much of the last few years documenting patterns of harm and supporting advocacy efforts and helping generally to translate women's or survivors' lived experiences into evidence that can be used in national, regional, and international spaces. This work is done in collaboration with survivors, with grassroots organizations, with healthcare workers, and with Tigrayans generally who are still fighting and trying to find different ways to exist. The conflict in Tigray has paused for now in terms of guns, but it has continued for women who are still suffering sexual slavery in the different occupied parts. Around 40% of Tigray is still occupied. And yeah, this is the place I'm coming from when I speak for the rest of the panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. Judge Pope, we're so happy you were able to reconnect. If Your Honor would please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Thank you. I'm not sure why the video is not appearing, but I will just share that I am the Chief Judge at the Nottawasapi Huron Band of the Potawatomi Tribal Court, and I'm also the Chief Justice at the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, also pronounced Odawa. And I also teach federal American Indian law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. I have been working in the nonviolence movement within the United States for many, many years, and am very grateful for the opportunities that Nottawasapi has given me with being able to engage in the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women in particular, but also girls, our two-spirit relatives, and Indigenous LGBTIQ+, as well as men. And we have seen just not only high rates of violence, but also that we have a unique situation with the majority of people who are committing the violence being non-native. That doesn't mean that there's not violence that's committed within Indigenous communities. That does, of course, happen. But the real height of the problem, the real core of the problem, has to do with a situation that has been created according to the United States Supreme Court and Congress, which I'll be getting into when I talk a little bit more. But it's from that place that I do this work. And we see, especially in Michigan, folks often concentrate on the southern border, and we are on the northern border. We're right on the border of Canada. And we see Indigenous relatives, again, not necessarily acknowledging those borders that were imposed upon us versus ones that we created, that are being trafficked not only throughout the United States, not only throughout Indian country, but throughout the world. And it's created from systems that we can fix. And so many of us have been very active in trying to fix those systems to decrease this epidemic of violence and this missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and relatives crisis that we have. So that's a little bit about my work. And then I'll talk about the courts when you'd like me to.
Thank you so much, Judge Pope. And for audience members who may be unfamiliar with tribal courts, would you mind telling us a little bit about tribal sovereignty, tribal courts, and the interplay with federal law?
I am happy to do that because that's what's causing the problem. So, in the early stages of the United States, there was an initial Supreme Court case called Johnson v. McIntosh. And any attorney would know that case through a property class. I will add that it was very difficult for that to be my very first class of my very first day in law school, because that case is the foundational case in American Indian law. And yet there are no natives who are in this case. It is about the sale of land looking at ownership between two individuals now, non-natives, one who received the land or purchased the land, I should say, from the government, and one from a native person. And what the Supreme Court decided is that Indigenous peoples had the right to occupy this land and had what was called Indian title. And that meant that we could possess it, but we could not sell it. This, along with interpretation in other cases and through the years of different questions that went up with any challenge around Indigenous rights and around tribal nations' rights, created our kind of body of sovereignty. So it was somewhat limited, but then consistently reaffirmed. Regardless of the terminology, there was recognition of tribal nations as nations. That being said, they limited tribal courts and tribal nations sovereignty and jurisdiction, pulling it back repeatedly. And the first, I guess you'd say, big blow is to not have criminal jurisdiction over non-natives. This is a huge problem, and this is what is creating our epidemic of violence against Indigenous relatives, is that tribal nations themselves do not have the restored inherent jurisdiction to prosecute and to address according to our ways, as well as looking at the criminal justice systems that are in place, having resources to work within those systems in order to rehabilitate or well, I shouldn't say or, holding accountable is always an aspect of what we're doing, always. However, we don't have jurisdiction to prosecute and, let's say, put somebody in prison for life if they have raped and murdered an Indigenous person, trafficked them for 10 years and then killed them. We can't prosecute those. The federal government must prosecute those. And when they don't, which is far too often, we are left in a situation of literally being open to violence, creating perpetrators that have now become predators because of the systems. It is a well-known endeavor in numerous Native communities throughout the United States of young men in particular targeting Indigenous girls and Indigenous women for rape, for other assaults and even for murder, because they know that they will not go out to a federal prison for it. They're not going to spend life in prison. They're not going to be held accountable in the same way as if they rape and murder a non-native person off of tribal land. So this is the problem, right? And many of the tribes are fighting for two things, which is not only the restoration of our inherent jurisdiction so that our tribal justice systems can address these issues, but also the resources to actually implement the new systems that we create. So that's probably longer than you wanted, but we hold very strongly to our inherent sovereignty of tribal nations and the right to protect. And for many, many nations, it is considered a sacred duty to protect its people and its visitors too. So every person that visits a casino, we want to protect you as well.
Thank you, Judge Pope. Not too long at all. And following up, you are speaking about the magnitude and the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Would you mind elaborating, please, on the broader issue of femicide affecting Indigenous communities?
Unfortunately, I think that's something that everyone on the panel can speak to in very different ways. The jurisdictional scheme that I was discussing has created what are almost considered invisible victims. It's one of the reasons why I like Miss Cassay's book title so much, about In Plain Sight, because Indigenous people are everywhere, and they are there. But they are being attacked, they are disappearing, and it took a law in the United States to even begin to track that. And that tracking is nowhere near where we need it. So in looking at how folks are targeted, so as I said, we do see attacks on men as well as Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTIQ folks. However, the rate of violence, especially trafficking and our murdered women, is so much higher than other communities. They are targets. And when we target our women, we target our future. Women are the ones who give life in our communities. When you have no regard for women, it often affects the growth of the community. It affects the ability of the community to sustain. It is a direct attack on the community as a whole. And we must make the commitment to protect women, to stop the annihilation of Indigenous peoples and tribal nations. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Judge Pope.
Yes.
Faith, your courage, resilience, and extraordinary self-advocacy is profound and apparent in everything that you do. Can you describe for us some of the ways that you so expertly navigated challenges that you experienced as an Indigenous survivor at the time that you needed help and assistance most following the escape of your traffickers?
Thank you so much, Jessica. Yes, so first I would like to start with how law enforcement approached me. When I escaped while still being a 17-year-old, I found myself with not having, even though the person spoke Spanish, Spanish is my second language. My native language is Colchol, and something that did help me a lot during that time was that I was able to told the agent like what I had been through. I didn't understand it very clearly, but something that made a very big change was that he said to me these clear words that made a huge difference. We have been investigating cases like yours. You're not the only minor. We are familiar with these cases. That made such a huge difference. From there, they put me in touch with this wonderful lawyer who did speak Spanish, but there were some things missing there. They didn't understand very well my culture, even though they thought they could help me in better ways. They did such an amazing job, actually, but there were things missing there, and during translation as well. When I had to testify as well, I had this lawyer who spoke Spanish, who had experience working with minors, but there were a lot of things missing during translation, having an interpreter there, because the interpreter didn't understood my culture, didn't understood something that I like to tell people is, if you are familiar with cases specifically from Tenancingo, for example, you know this is a family trafficking ring, or these are like a big organized crime. Let's name it that way. So, with that being said, it is hard for somebody to come and talk to law enforcement. Even though I had the courage to go there, I went into a new NYPD present. They heard me. They listened to me. They provided me with help, with finding me a lawyer. But there was some harm during that time too, because it's not just bringing the victim, listen to your story. They leave you more traumatized. They left me more traumatized during that time, more depressed, and I felt like I didn't had those resources to decompress. And also, I like to mention that I didn't felt like I could have advocated for myself and say, this is so tiring to me. These interviews are way harming, because they would go over and over through the same questions. And with that being said, this case was turned out to go through sentencing and all of that stuff. And I found myself with turning 18 years old, not being able to have access to English class, because I had to be a 21-year-old to have access to education, just English class. And I have a hard time. And I like to mention this. Sanctuary for Families actually helped me to get English class. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to have access to them. And the time that I did, the teacher got angry at me. So now I'm not just only forgetting my native language, I am forced to learn English, and then also Spanish. I went through a lot of loops, ups and downs, to somebody to finally understand me and to communicate. At some point, I even translated during the hearing, during the time that I was testifying, because I felt like there were things missing during that time. Also, I noticed that other Indigenous survivors were having a hard time communicating their needs. We can all be, I was personally afraid to come forward and share my story with law enforcement. Who wouldn't be scared? I was scared because I was afraid of the criminal records. Uh, I was scared if I was going to be deported to Mexico, but then also I was scared and afraid from my traffickers. What if they come back after me? That's another thing there. And then also, we have PTSD. There are still needs and resources. if lawyers can tell us, for example, for how long you're going to be able to be eligible for resources, that would be very helpful. Also to know um, who can help you in which areas, who can be there for you. And something that I like to mention too is, who do we go with? Who do you go and talk to when you have an Indigenous survivor here? Where do you go, right? I would recommend to consult to survivors who are Indigenous, who understand the culture. It might not be 100%, but at least to have the knowledge on how to interact with us. Because sometimes I feel like there has been harm without meaning to do it. And it's because we don't know. You don't know what an Indigenous survivor is going through. There are a lot of things that I personally was told. If somebody's helping you, you have to help them back, or you have to give back. And something that I learned was, we are here to help you, but we do not expect nothing from you. And that's something that I respect and appreciate from Sanctuary for Families.
Thank you so much, Faith. Nihat.
Rita, I have some questions for you, but before I start the questions, I want to salute you that you're still in Tigray. Usually people move out from the fire. You jumped right into the fire at this time. So thank you for all you do. Based on what you shared earlier, you come from a very rich background, both as an engineer and now as a new voice for those who don't have a voice. And I just want to ask, drawing from your experience, both your work in Sudan and in Tigray, how have you, what are the specific harms that you've noticed that Indigenous women, Yoruba women, have suffered? And how have you managed to get their voice out into the world?
Thank you, Nihat. I hope you guys can hear me again. And I'll start by echoing what Faith and Judge Pope mentioned, what Faith said specifically on the barriers around language and so on, in terms of Indigenous women trying to seek justice. In terms of the harms that I have witnessed, the suffering of Indigenous people in Tigray has been generally historically ignored. And what women in Tigray, especially during the conflict, including the women in Irob, experienced was not incidental harm. It was very targeted, very gendered and devastating. Women and girls were subject to all forms of rape, gang rape, sexual torture, forced humiliation, reproductive violence, and so on, and enforced impregnation as well. And the violence was broader than just those, and they have continued to endure, and they continue to now as well, displacement, starvation, the siege, loss of family members, and destruction of their own homes and livelihoods. As well as the general destruction of the healthcare system in Tigray. So these women continue to suffer in every sense of the word. I also want to add that scale in this sense matters, especially for Indigenous minorities. In terms of sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence, around 300, like the Tigray Regional Health Bureau has predicted around 300,000 women and girls to have faced conflict-related sexual violence in one way or another. This number is still to be studied more thoroughly. And as you know as well, Nihat, because of the barriers to accessing information, which is one of the reasons why I live in Tigray and have been documenting the last few years. Many investigators have not been able to go into the region to look properly at the sexual violence and other forms of violence that the people have faced. In 2021, when the federal government of Ethiopia and Eritrea, as well as some militia groups, entered Tigray and made sure that there was a blockade and a siege, 360 degrees for around 2 years. We started advocating for independent mechanisms to go into the region and investigate what had taken place. And at first, we had OCHA and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission that gave a really skewed version of the story. We had atrocities and massacres that were not even documented or looked at all, including the atrocities that the Irob people had faced. My own family members, more than 11 family members were killed during a specific massacre on Christmas Day in 2021. And this was not something that OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission documented. Because of this, we started doing a lot of advocacy to have other forms of inquiries going into the region. And because of this, we had the ICRI, Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, set up. But this commission was not allowed into the region and had to take interviews on the phone. They were also not allowed into Sudan, where we were. And even in this sense, women in the refugee camps that I worked in could not access the phone lines or anything else to be able to report what had happened to them. So these women are not targeted just as women, but members of communities that have been politically neglected and geographically isolated for many years, and have been treated as though their testimonies have been expendable. The Ethiopian government did a very good job at silencing and making sure that nothing comes out from that region. The ICRI itself was also prematurely ended its mandate, and all of the interviews that we worked so hard to get to this commission have not served justice to the communities that they were supposed to give justice to. And now we have women in Irob still currently from the indigenous minority facing sexual violence, especially by Eritrean troops. So it's still conflict-related sexual violence, and walking 12 hours to try to access healthcare, maybe more than 12 hours in some instances. And
Rita, I think we might have lost the connection. Until we Ruchira, you shared a lot about your work with the Dalit community as part of APNIAP and all. One thing I took note of, which was a very powerful message, is how women, collective women, have the power to change things. But I wanted to ask, the women that you worked with, the Dalit community, this marginalized group, how does their caste system, or how does their identity or the social exclusion intersect with the vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation?
I work with the Dalit community, but I also work with other marginalized castes who are known as backward classes in India. We have a whole stratification. And also I work among indigenous groups who are known as denotified criminal tribes. As I explained earlier, that they were labeled as criminal tribes by law under British colonialism. And then when India became independent, we denotified the law, but the stigma and discrimination remained. And these tribes were basically divided between being pushed into backward class groups and scheduled caste groups, which are either Dalits or marginalized groups. And I'm trying to speak very loudly, but I don't know why the mic doesn't seem to. Okay, let me try. Is this better? No. Okay. Um, so I work with denotified tribes in India who were labeled as criminal tribes under British colonialism, along with Dalit communities. And the question was that what are the challenges and what is this caste system that we have to try to overcome in India? Now, in some of the castes that I work with, between this combination of feudalism, where certain groups like Devadasis were dedicated, the women of that community were dedicated to temples and then asked to have sex with the priest before they were sold off to zamindars and princes and small kingly estates. And when India became independent and modern, then they were still donated to temples, to a goddess, had to have sex with the priest, and then sent off to the brothels of Mumbai and other places. And prostitution was passed down from mother to daughter intergenerationally. Among denotified tribes who were labeled as criminal tribes, which I mentioned earlier, prostitution became inevitable because these tribes were deprived of land and livelihood, and they had to stay in as quarters on the land owned by government and landlords. And in return, they had to do menial chores, but also make the women sexually available. And there too, prostitution became inevitable because that was what they were made to do. The men were taught to pimp their own sisters and daughters, and slowly pimping became intergenerational, and also prostitution from mother to daughter or mother-in-law to daughter-in-law. And all this was categorized under normalized by caste. Now, many of you may have seen the documentary called Origin, where people ask, what is caste? It's not race, but it is a hierarchy where certain people are made inferior because of their occupations. That if you have to, and then asked to stay on in those occupations, saying this is their destiny and this is what their future holds and this is what they're supposed to do. Like I described Devadasis. So when Apneya began working in such communities, there was the idea that this is fate, this is normal, this is destined. And there was no question of choice. It was what you were supposed to do. And the entire community, the families believed in it, the fathers, the mothers, the children who were born there were growing up believing this was the fate. So when we started our community centers and classrooms, we were threatened because we were disrupting something which was considered normal. And we were not just threatened by criminals, we were also threatened by the social order around us because we were disrupting how people lived. And also upsetting the caste hierarchy, like when you upset race relations in a certain place, the lynchings, and the violence which is faced by people here in the United States, or the indigenous people that have been described earlier. So we had to create protection circles around us. And the first circle was, as you said, we organized the women into small groups and called them self-action groups. And we said that if someone shows up to attack you all because you're sending your child to school, just form a circle and stand up together night or day, because apne aap staff members cannot stand there. The second thing we had to do was help them get documents, because such marginalized communities were not given birth certificates, caste certificates, voter ID. So we had to get them certificates and documents so they could become citizens of India, and then also access entitlements which were supposed to be there for marginalized people suffering from intergenerational poverty, low cost food, low cost housing, low cost healthcare. And all this, we face the backlash from knives being pulled out on us, our offices being ransacked, our staff members being stabbed. Even the police who were from upper caste would jail our staff members. But we learned how to use the law to our favor, because I'm speaking to a room full of lawyer activists here. And we taught the women how to file a police complaint and testify in court. And together we went collectively in groups of 10, 100, 1,000, whatever we could muster, and keep at it, just very much like your civil rights movement here, where person after person just kept doing the thing, riding a bus or going to school. We just kept doing it. And today we can report that Apne Aap has, put 64 traffickers in jail, but we have also organized more than 20,000 women across the country to exit systems of prostitution, educated more than 1,400 girls through school and college who would, it's unimaginable in these communities because they were intergenerationally prostituted for over 300 years. So this is the cycle that we are changing, reversing, all through the organizing of women's collectives in the red light areas and then helping them access what are their rights and entitlement. So we have literally put together the idea, the fight for social justice, where basic needs are human rights, and then going and fighting for human rights. Because just as many of you know, there's a debate going on across the world about sex work, right? And people keep saying prostitution is stigmatizing, but the word sex work is not. Actually, both are equally exploitative, whatever language you name it. And when you put in the word into the language of work, then we normalize the sexual exploitation. And I have seen what normalization of sexual exploitation does to these indigenous groups and to the Dalit communities that I work with, and how hard it is to challenge it. So we have to be careful that we should not allow the normalization of sexual exploitation by letting it be called sex work right now. We are right in the middle of that. So between feudalism, colonialism, and capitalism, they do the same thing to women. Thank you.
Uh, Ruchira, that was very good. One thing you touched on is when we talk about access to justice, I think most of us, at least I used to think that it used to be all about legal framework and legal institutions, but you brought up a good point that it starts from legal awareness, teaching or showing the women you worked with how to file a police complaint by itself is very, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add one more point? It
Yes.
starts from legal awareness, but you can't provide legal awareness if you don't have a safe space. And in that safe space, if people are hungry and they are scared, then, they need, scared about not having a roof over their heads, or if they are just hungry in that moment, they can't pay attention to legal awareness camps. So we understood that there are blocks to legal empowerment, which begin with first fulfilling basic needs. And that's how I began to understand that basic needs are human rights when people are so marginalized and deprived. And then comes legal awareness, and then comes legal access, and then comes justice.
I agree 100%. I guess in that sense, my follow-up question would be, you mentioned there's a gap between the survivor's need and the justice system that's meant to protect them. What do you think is of a solution in this case? What would fill the gap from your experience? You've done good with creating the Women Collective and that action, but what other solutions would you identify in this case?
So, survivors, first of all, I think that grassroots work is really important. And nothing can be done top down, because it's like throwing seeds into the air. Where it will not take root. But if you plant seeds into the earth, it will become a tree which will give us shade and fruits. So change begins from the bottom and transforms the top. That is my first lesson that I've learned running Apne Aap, because when I began Apne Aap, I had no idea. I was a journalist who'd made a documentary. But the women in Kamtipura and Mumbai said that you've got to do more. And I responded, I didn't even know how to make a business plan. And I asked the women that, what do you want? What are your dreams? And they said they had 4 dreams, which were very basic. They said they wanted school for their children. They wanted a room of their own, Virginia Woolf in a brothel in Mumbai, where they could sleep without being disturbed, because a customer can walk into a brothel night or day, where their children would not be exploited, and where there would be no noise and fighting and all of that. They wanted a room of their own. And the third thing they said they wanted was a job in an office, which really meant fixed monthly income, no violence, old age pension, treatment with dignity, proper working conditions, which were not based on body invasion, which led to disease and death. And the fourth thing they said, they wanted justice and dignity. Justice meant punishment of the perpetrators. They said, we want those who bought us and sold us, who brokered away our dreams, to be punished. So that became our business plan. And we listened to the women and organized the way they understood and they knew, because people affected by the problem know the solutions. So that was my learning, that if you listen to the people affected by the problem, then the solutions will be the best ones. And then the third was carrying the voice. Amplifying the voices of survivors was the third lesson I learned through the grassroots organizing, which was that, it's okay to speak on behalf of someone. And I've done that all my life because I'm a journalist and an activist, but also to enable and empower survivors to speak up. There's nothing more important than truth to power. And when a survivor can speak up, everything changes. So it was hard initially because there's trauma, there's shame, there's fear, there's guilt, and we needed to overcome all of that. And some survivors did, some did not. But the ones who did actually change the ecosystem for everybody else. And we know that right now, the most powerful people in our world right now are actually being forced to be accountable for the actions of sexual exploitation by survivors, as we know with the Epstein files. Every day things are unfolding in spite of resistance, in spite of murders, in spite of oppression, threats, everything. Survivors are coming forward and speaking, and we thought they were the most powerless, but they are the ones shifting the power. And they are the ones holding all the most powerful people accountable. So these are the four lessons I learned along the way.
Thank you, Ruchira.
Faith, you articulated for us earlier the ways in which linguistic and cultural misunderstanding, at the very least, can limit access to justice, and at the other end of the spectrum be deeply harmful. In your opinion, what would a trauma-informed and culturally respectful response look like from legal practitioners or from law enforcement? What could that system look like?
Well, first and most, something that I like to mention is if you think that learning a new language is hard, imagine for a survivor who has experienced a complex trauma, it's going to take longer to learn a new language. First, you must have to be patient with that survivor. If you need to consult with Indigenous survivors, someone who understands the culture. Also, I would recommend, if you could, to talk to other people who are Indigenous from all over the country. Something that I noticed during the time of my trafficking is that victims were from all over the country, not just from Mexico. I met people from all kinds of Indigenous communities. So I would recommend to consult as many Indigenous uh, people as you can. And also, I would recommend to consult with lived experience consultants as well. That can also help you to be more equipped when it comes to help Indigenous survivors. In that way, you're not going to cause harm into their lives. Law enforcement would know how to interact with us to be able to, I say, if you want a victim to be your witness, you have to listen to us. Treat me like a human being. Treat me with respect. Treat me like how you wish to be treated. And also, listen to that victim. You may not be able to have somebody who's specifically from her region, from her culture, but she can teach you things without you knowing. That's something that somebody told me, I've learned so many things from you. And it took me time to actually take it in. So something that I like to say is listen to us. Never be afraid to get feedback from me. If you ever have questions, ask them. Never be afraid, whether you're a law enforcement, a social worker, uh, somebody in the healthcare system. They also need help, not just one area, right? We are in every aspect, everybody needs to be trained, needs the knowledge, so we can stop the harming. And instead of the harming, if we can provide resources, respect, love, and provide the education that the individual needs, you're going to make a huge impact into that individual's life. And at the end, what you will hear after the case is over is how well you did, in which areas you need to improve, what kind of interpreter you need. Not just somebody who learned Spanish, somebody who actually knows the language, somebody who understands actually what they're meaning, what they're saying. Because I translated myself, because I felt like the interpreter was missing so many things. Yet I was told I had to stop at some point, which is not okay. I wish they would have let me still continue and explain myself so they wouldn't missing pieces. Even though, even after all of that, we did get to the point where the sentence took place and the case is been over. But we could have gained more precious information. We could have help, it could have helped me and the other victims in a better way, where we could have left more understood. But when you're also helping somebody make sure they have the tools and the resources they need after testifying, you need to decompress. Who's going to be your support? Who will be there in the next couple of days? Who's going to be going there with you during that time? I like to mention that when I testified, Jessica was there supporting me. And I made an art for her. And during that time, Jessica asked me, what would you like to do? And it was just a small little thing for her, probably. For me, it was a huge thing. I ended up making an art for her. Um, and that helped me not just to decompress, but to relax. There are multiple ways into how to help a, a survivor during those hard times. There are better ways to interact with us. Imagine if that small little thing that Jessica Century for Family did for me, not just her, but also the members of the Survivors Council of PACT. They also went to the court with me during trial and sentencing to support me. But something that I noticed during that time is during the sentencing, and there is something called victim impact statement when you go and speak, is that I was the only survivor who had a lot of support. I felt like I had so many people supporting me, but yet there was the other survivor, the other victim, who was just herself and the lawyer. Later on, I found out she didn't even do the things that Jessica did for me. And I understood that Jessica had learned something different. And I wish other lawyers could do something like that. Help your clients, find the resources, ask for help if you don't know how to help an individual. Because, yes, it feels bad to be on your own. It's not easy to be completely on your own and not what to expect. I felt bad because I had a lot of support during that time, but at the same time, I understand that my peers, my colleagues were there to support me. And since then, I've never felt alone. And that's something that I love to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faith. And it was an extraordinary moment for me to receive your generous and beautiful artwork. And it is with me every day in my office. And thank you again. Judge Pope, you described for us a very grave situation that Indigenous communities are facing. Has there been progress? And if not, what should progress look like?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yes, I do think that there has been progress. One of the reasons I think that is we're all here today. So people are listening, and they're not listening at the level that we need them to listen. We have a very long way to go, but at least it started. We also have some legislation that has passed. Again, we have a very long road to go before the systems that are being created to properly track missing Indigenous peoples is actually capturing all of the data. And of course, I shouldn't say data, all of the people, all of the names of the people who are missing. We have in our communities, and when I say communities too, I want to make clear that that's both the tribal nations and also urban and rural areas, different community centers, or different groups that get together in areas where it might be a little bit more intertribal. It may be from a assimilation policy where folks from different tribes moved to that area and just stayed. It could be a university. It could be a whole different set of circumstances. But those entities know who is missing too, in addition to the tribes. So we need different advocate organizations, as well as the federal government, as well as the tribes being empowered to create and participate in different programs that reach out to tracking when somebody is missing, but more importantly, responding when someone is missing. One thing that we do know about trafficking is that they try to move victims very quickly. And it is, well, that's also depending on the type of trafficking. There are different types, and it can look different ways, but that is one issue. In addition, we know that a person who is missing, that their risk for violence increases with every passing minute. We need law enforcement and community, whether that be tribal nations or urban centers, rural centers, to respond quickly when especially a minor's gone missing. But when we know someone is gone, it needs to not be the discussions that we hear so often that are filled with prejudice. We hear so often that a teenager or an adult has gotten intoxicated and has just wandered off, and it gets ruled as exposure if the body is found. If it's not, and somebody is in danger, has been trafficked, or has been taken for violence to a different area, every minute is absolutely precious in responding to that person being missing. We don't have time for those kinds of excuses. We need communities to respond. That's something that we're working on in Michigan, and trying to build culturally honoring responses to when individual Indigenous folks go missing, or people from the community. Looking at our connections on all the different levels, as well as having, I guess you'd say, supplies, approaches, bringing in family, bringing in people from the community that can educate those who are searching, whether that's law enforcement and community organizers, or primarily law enforcement or primarily community organizers, but we really want law enforcement in there. We can help them know the cultural pieces, as well as, if they find the person, how to interact and respond to them in a culturally honoring way, so that more trauma is not caused, as Faith talked about, and how absolutely devastating it is for a victim or survivor to be re-traumatized or newly traumatized by folks who mean well but are causing harm. So we're working on putting together a summit through the Attorney General MMIP task force. The different tribes are working on plans within the communities. Some of the Indigenous centers are working on plans. These things are just critical to helping us address and really make some type of real progress. And I will say that every person that we are able to get to safety, or that we hear about getting to safety, is just a gift that we are so grateful for, and it is worth the sacrifices of many to really be involved in trying to make these changes. But we do have a long way to go, and we do need better legislation, and we do need our sovereignty restored. We need the resources to hold offenders accountable, and to put in prevention efforts, real prevention efforts that are culturally honoring and are going to work within our communities, not a cookie cutter that somebody else is successful with.
Thank you, Judge Pope. Rita, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Cut off
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
We can all hear you. Sorry, you were cut off earlier when you were explaining about your work and what with the AU and the UN on the investigation of the conflict-based crimes in Europe and Tigray. I can ask a follow-up, or maybe you can summarize that answer for us with this question as well. You mentioned the investigation didn't go well because there was barrier to information, and the barriers to information is one way of deterring justice. If you can summarize that answer, or finish that answer, and also tell us, in your opinion, based on what you've seen, in you living in Sudan for more than a year with the refugees, and now in Tigray for more than 2 years, what does justice look like for Indigenous women that are in a conflict zone? And what has the women that you worked with, the survivors, shared with you? What is the one thing they want to see? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nihat. So in terms of what I was saying earlier about these international mechanisms not having the access that they needed to do the work that they were supposed to do, and ending prematurely and so on, this was done systemically by the Ethiopian government, so that that they were not held to account, essentially. The ICRI wasn't allowed into Sudan, wasn't allowed into Ethiopia, could not do investigations as thoroughly as they needed. They had to do phone interviews, as I said earlier, and the mandate ended extremely prematurely, while there was violence across the whole region. We were extremely disappointed by the results of that, but with the limited information that they had, ICRI managed to determine that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed in the region. And with the work in Sudan, Nihat, I will say, to touch on what Ruchira was saying as well, that I learned the hard way that I think elites, or people who are, generally advocating on the internet and are in these spaces and are not really from grassroots, we tend to love, and I think it's important that we do as well, we really focus on impunitive justice. And this is important. We should go after perpetrators, we should go after states for committing crimes at this scale. But what I realized after working and going door to door in the refugee camps in Sudan and interviewing victims of these crimes was that we don't understand who the justice is for. There's a case, for example, in the case of Tigray in Germany, a universal jurisdiction case, and it's technically on behalf of victims, but the victims that we work with, for example, would probably never know that this case is happening in Germany. And it's important that we go after the perpetrators specifically, but we really do not give enough attention to victims as well. So justice itself, I've learned, has to be understood a lot more broadly. And for the women that we work with, especially women that are experiencing ongoing instability, justice isn't like in a courtroom, and it's also smaller things like even being believed. If any of you go to Tigray, like I was saying, because there was such a horrible communications blockade that was one of the longest, if not the longest, in the history of the world. The women and the people in Tigray generally will want to tell you everything that they have experienced. So them being listened to in this sense is even so important. But it's also access to healthcare, it's reparations, it's non-repetition. Now where, as Nihat was saying, it's a limbo kind of situation where Ethiopia may be fighting with Eritrea for reasons that are not so obvious. Some people say it's for the Red Sea and so on. And this is really affecting Tigray, which is in between the two countries. If another war broke out, it would be extremely catastrophic. Tigray would be the battleground for it. And for people who've lost 500,000, close to 1 million people during the last war, this would completely devastate the region. We've seen the last 2 weeks that so many young people have left the region. So they themselves are not receiving any form of justice in this sense. I'll give you an example of some of the victim groups that we work with. For example, the healthcare professionals who were also victims during the conflict, who had to work under such extreme circumstances with no gloves, without any access to medication, seeing their patients die on a daily basis, did not receive their salaries for 17 months during the conflict, for example. And this completely is reducing the quality of life overall. It means that they're having to go back and forth to court because of rent they weren't able to pay during the conflict, where they had absolutely nothing. An example of the Irob victims that we work with, their first priority in terms of justice is for the people who are occupying the land, violently occupying the land, to leave, and for the people who are displaced across all of Tigray to be able to return home and return home safely where they can work and so on. This is the same for women from Western Tigray who are still displaced because of occupation on their land. Because for these people, if they're able to return home and able to work and cultivate food and so on, then they can think about the next steps. They can heal psychologically. They can then think about impunitive justice as we are able to think about it from a privileged perspective. I also wanted to commend the tracker that Judge Melissa Pope was speaking about. We also have been documenting hundreds of enforced disappearances from this tiny minority from around the 1998 war in Tigray. And this is something that has been completely neglected. We have been trying to work with the families of the disappeared to document what happened to their loved ones and to create some form of memorialization for these people. And memorialization in and of itself is a form of justice for them. They don't want their loved ones to be disappeared and be completely forgotten about. This creates extreme trauma for these families. They're not able to have some form of peace, knowing where their families are, even if it's that they've been killed, and they're not in any way taken care of by the states or the institutions that are supposed to be protecting them. And I'll end by saying that this is not unique to Tigray. While I was in Sudan, many refugees were going into Libya, into other regions, fleeing conflict and experiencing horrible forms of violence.
We lost her again. I think she was going to tell us examples of the trafficked Irob women and men during the conflict, but we'll have her conclude that with the next question. I'll give it back to you, Joyce.
So earlier, Judge Pope touched on embracing the gifts along the way. And I heard that as hope, and hope has the potential to be fundamental in filling the well of strength that's needed to continue on every day amidst tremendous difficulty and struggle. Our final question for all of the panelists, beginning with you, Ruchira, is what gives you hope?
This room gives me hope. You know, all of you sitting here doing something to advance women's rights gives me hope. The fact that in 30 years since I began working on human trafficking, we were able to change laws. We did get the UN protocol. That gives me hope. The power of women's collective action gives me hope. The Epstein survivors speaking up in spite of everything which is going on gives me hope. So yeah, all of us gives me hope.
Thank you. Rita, are you back online? Faith, may I pose the same question to you? What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is seeing you and other people connected today and those who are present to be open and listen to us. That gives me hope that some of you may be open into talking to survivor leaders, to lived experience consultants, to train you more. Maybe there are questions that you have that you can bring it in and help women and children and make the difference and not leave them more traumatized. That's what I want to leave it with. Making a big difference into the lives of those individuals who really need your help, who need that hope in their lives, and you can make that change. Thank you.
Thank you. Judge Pope, may I ask you as well, what gives you hope?
I have to repeat what everyone else said about seeing the people who have engaged in this this forum in this program to listen and learn more about Indigenous issues, Indigenous trauma, Indigenous hardships, and how to assist, how to be a part of the solution, right? That means the world, because I do believe that one person can make a change, and it might be in one person's life, but that person then affects others as well. It sounds simple and it sounds almost silly, but it is something that I've witnessed over and over again. And I'm always amazed at how far down just one, and I'm not just going to say kindness, but educated kindness, right? We want folks to become trained. And I'll tell anybody who's working in this area, there's always something new to learn. It is always worth it to go to a training, even if you hear the same thing over and over again, because you hear it in different ways throughout your life. So I really encourage people to be a part of the solution. And I do believe that you being here today, all of you, is being part of the solution. And I'm so inspired by the other panelists that you all are such amazing people and doing such incredible work. And you give me hope. And you also give me comfort in knowing that you all are out there taking care of so many people. And so I say Chimigwach to you.
Thank you, Judge Pope. And turning to you, Rita, I'm sorry you were cut off again. If you would like to finish your remarks, and then in conclusion, I would pose the same question to you. Your courage and fortitude is enormous. What gives you hope?
I'll say that this is always such a difficult question for me, but I'll say that it's the women themselves, the women that I've worked with the last few years, the women who've survived the worst horrors. I've seen them become documenters, advocates, caregivers, community leaders, and pursuers of justice themselves, and that gives me hope. And it gives me hope also that this is often in solidarity with solidarity between the different groups. We've connected some of our survivor groups, for example, with survivor groups in the Rohingya who have also suffered genocide. And they continue to work with groups in Sudan and in other places and recognize each other's struggles and to build solidarity between them. And this is what gives them hope, and it's what keeps me going as well in many ways.
Thank you, Rita. And to all of our panelists, we are so deeply grateful for you taking your time to generously share with us your words, your wisdom, and your remarks. I will pass it to Nihat. We have some questions and answers from the audience, and then we'll conclude with some remarks.
Thank you. We do have some interesting questions. There's one specifically for Judge Pope. It says, what has been or what do you believe the biggest obstacles are for the kind of change to the jurisdictional system that's needed to ensure proper judicial protections and prosecution for the vulnerable Indigenous women and girls, while still retaining tribal nations' right to sovereignty?
And that last piece is the biggest challenge. One of the really important protests that was held years ago was the Quilt Walk for Justice, and it was around a case involving Dollar General where they challenged tribal jurisdiction. And mind you, we didn't have criminal jurisdiction in that case. A perpetrator was held civilly liable, so it was about paying money, and Dollar General didn't want to pay the money. And those oral arguments were incredibly insulting to Indigenous nations, with the assumption that we are inferior and cannot be just and fair to other people. And Mary Catherine Nagel, who is a brilliant Native attorney and playwright, came out of those arguments very upset. And then she said to me about sitting there and listening to these arguments and the insults from the Supreme Court when her court, the Cherokee Supreme Court, had been in existence before the United States Supreme Court. And I always remember that when asked about how to create the systems or how to create our justice systems, retain who we are, and yet at the same time fulfill the requirements that the United States keeps putting on us. And tribes are doing it all over the United States. They are keeping traditional ways. They are, in some cases, codifying them, in some cases, just teaching them, sharing them, webinars, seminars, whatever it may be. It's done through the court systems. It's done through all these different places. It's very visible, which is a requirement. And we look at the requirements that Congress tries to put on us, or the Supreme Court, and we look for how we can make that fit us. And sometimes it can, and sometimes it can't. And then the community, the tribe as a whole, decides whether or not it is important enough to change the way that they're doing things. And I'm very pleased that many tribes are saying violence against Indigenous women and girls is important enough to figure out how to do this. So there's no simple answer. There's no way where you just say, oh, this step will retain sovereignty. But it has to be done on a community level in tribal nations. That's who we are. We are community-based peoples. And we need to decide it together and figure out how we're going to do it together to protect our people. So, miigwech.
Thank you so much, Judge Pope. The questions that I have are from our online audience. Maybe if there's anyone in the room that wants to ask a question, we would like to open it up for anyone here before I continue. Okay, I'll read the next question. This is, I think, for Ruchira and Rita. As a young Indigenous woman in the USAID, dedicating her academic career to bringing attention to these issues, what can we do to break through these barriers? For example, funding, pushback, lack of expertise here, and what opportunities do you see to advance Indigenous women's issues? How can Indigenous women around the world work together in solidarity?
Does Rita want to go first while I think about the answer?
Sure, while we have her connection as well.
Thank you. So can you repeat the last bit of the question, Nihat, please?
Yes. What can we do to break through the barriers within the Indigenous communities? How can we help either with funding or with pushback or with developing our expertise? And how, in terms of solidarity, you mentioned on your last answer about solidarity. So how can Indigenous women around the globe work together in solidarity? What do you suggest?
I think the first bit is, especially coming from, you said USAID, I think, is that like large international organizations often treat Indigenous people as like almost like a sacrificial lamb. And we've experienced this even in the context of Tigray, where there have been some institutes that have, that genocide can happen also against the nation, and the nation of Tigray includes non-Tigrinya speaking people as well. It includes the Irob, Indigenous Irob, and the Kunama minorities. And because it was easier to make the case that it is the Tigrinya speaking people that were targeted when it came to the genocide, that's what they did. And they excluded the Indigenous Irob minority, even though the Irob minority were definitely not discriminated against when it came to the violence that took place in the region. So this is something to really look at, just because it's easier to say that a group of people who speak a specific language were targeted. That doesn't mean that is the truth, and that's something that should be pursued. So I think we need to be more nuanced in our approach as international organizations. And in terms of Indigenous people working together across the globe, I really think that is on all of us. As I was saying earlier, that we really try to work with groups from everywhere. There's a group of survivors in Nigeria, also in the Rohingya. But these problems are not special or specific to only us. And this is something that happens across the globe. As I was saying, Indigenous people in conflict zones like Sudan, Palestinian Indigenous people in Congo, and so on. It's on us as people in the grassroots and people in the international community who can connect others in the grassroots as well, to make sure that people are working together and amplifying the same cause, if that's Okay, I'll stop there, Nete.
Thank you, Rita.
Everything that Rita said, 100%. And to add to that, two things. One is that we have to make visible again and again and again what Indigenous people are going through, and especially Indigenous women and girls, from the disappearances to the violence to the normalization of marginalization to lack of state infrastructure or state responses to lack of funding, which you already asked about. All of this we have to keep making visible in whatever method we know how. If we know we are storytellers, tell the story. If we are filmmakers, make the film. If we are lawyers, bring it up in court testimonies, add it as case law. But let's keep doing it. Let's not stop making what has been normalized normal. Let's break that. That's the first thing. And the second is to build alliances. Besides, we are the anti-trafficking people. We work on violence against women. But what about building alliances with the climate change people? Because Indigenous groups are being affected by climate change, and they are being displaced because their land is very much sought after for natural resources. So we have to make cross-sectoral alliances to really tackle this together as a global community. These are the two things I think, of course, which are really important.
Thank you so much, Ruchira. Faith, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your story during your journey in accessing justice. With the same question, how would you say the solidarity between the different Indigenous groups would have helped your quest for justice?
Sorry, can you repeat that last part?
Okay. The same question that I asked Ruchira and Rita. How would you describe the solidarity that you might have experienced, or what do you think about having solidarity with other Indigenous groups? Would it have changed the outcome? Or I know you had started your own organization and your own work. In that light, what does solidarity between different Indigenous groups look like?
Well, first and most, I feel like it starts from educating yourself. Yes, I did start at a nonprofit because I felt like I didn't get the resources I needed. Yet I'm still working on it. Lack of education, it's still a problem. Sorry, but that's the reality. Funding. I am an immigrant, and there are barriers because there are status that it can't allow you to apply for some education funding. And there are so many things that I feel like are missing, not just for me, but for others. And I feel like to be able to fill them in is keep working hard, trying our best, and also working with others, helping each other, because there is no other way for us to make a difference. If you don't help somebody to learn a new language, how do you expect them to have a career, right? Can't expect me to jump when you haven't even teach me how to jump, how to walk. There are so many things that I feel like we could bring in by providing the educational resources to survivors. Mental health is another one too. Life skills, that's another one. And those are the areas that are missing out there. And yet only a few orgs are providing it. A few lawyers that I know, like Jessica, is doing the job that I feel like I wish I can get it back. There are so many things out there that we can change. And we start from by educating our own selves first and educating those who also need that education. So we start breaking those barriers to Indigenous survivors, to the language barrier. That's a huge one. Language barrier. There are a lot of survivors that I know that they also had to learn English, and that's really hard. Learning a new language is not easy. I started to learn English for 11 years ago, actually. I'm thinking through back. I started to learn English when I was 18 years old. I'm turning 19 this year. So it's a long ways to go. And the only way to get there is by providing those tools and the resources that survivors need and walk along the side with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faith. Are we good with time, or should I add 2 more questions or 1 more? Okay. For Judge Pope, hearing all the conversation amongst you and your panelists, what common patterns do you see that continue to place Indigenous women at risk? What you all have shared different stories from the conflict perspective, from the legal system and the tribunal justice as a survivor, and Ruchira also from helping. What are the common things that we've heard today that could have easily been identified, or how to be supported by the people in the room?
My first thought when you started the question was that we just heard that answer, which is resources. That resources are desperately needed in any Indigenous community that is trying to heal and protect themselves. But as I'm thinking that, resources still remains in there, but it's kind of a different perspective, which is our resources back. And this goes to a lot of what Rita was sharing. And the other comment about climate, which is part of the reason that Indigenous peoples tend to have so many challenges, is because we are targeted specifically for land and resources. The United States had policies for decades and decades that always sought to take the Indian out of the person, right? Save the Indian, kill the man, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the mantra, and it is still the mantra worldwide in different ways in different communities. We have to be seen as human first. I think that's probably why, in going back to the start of my comments and talking about being faced with the case of Johnson v. McIntosh on my very first day of law school, my very first class, was so devastating and disheartening, is because when you read through this case that is still good law, and mind you, considered pretty pro-Indigenous rights, because there was a recognition that we had a right to be here that was better than in some countries, in some areas. But throughout that opinion, it discusses Indigenous peoples as savage, as heathens, as less than human. And when you don't recognize people as your equal, it's much easier to harm them and to stomp on their rights. And that contributes to so much of how we become invisible, how we can become less important. We really need that full recognition of full human rights, of full equality, of full recognition. And we need the resources to support our own communities, or in instances like nonprofits or refugee areas, whatever it is, we need those resources to really help folks, and not just check a box, get rid of guilt because you sent a little something. We need to bring the humanity back into this work. Thank you. Language.
I think I should have that as the last word, bring the humanity into the work, because so much of our work has got so corporatized and so full of jargon and, in Excel spreadsheets, that we've lost sight of the person that we are working for, the last girl, as I call her, the one who's suffering from intersecting inequalities of class and caste and gender, and in India, caste, in America, race. And because of that, she's cut off from her basic needs. So I still come back to the basic needs as requiring funding. So resources, of course, but also, you know, I would say my call to action to everyone in the room today is that let's stick together. There's more and more coming in the world right now, which is going to be tough. We may not be able to travel as much as we could. We may not be able to have the resources to do what we want. And all we have is each other. So the human connection is really, really important at this time. That's one call to action. And the second is that support the work in any way you can of somebody you know who's working with these marginalized groups, Indigenous groups, Dalits, wherever they are, in whatever way you can, because you may think what you are going to do is very small and has no impact. It does. I've seen that when you begin to do something, you don't know whether it's big or small. Only time will show you that. But you have to do it as if it matters. So do something. And thirdly, I'll just do a shout out for my own book and also for the book In Plain Sight. Get the book, because when we write stories, we want people to read the stories and share the stories. That is why we are writing them, to break the silence. My book is called I Kick and I Fly. Dorchin showed it to all of you. I don't know if it's available right now, but it's available on Amazon and everywhere else. And In Plain Sight is also available on Amazon. So get the book, and that itself will help carry our stories more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ruchira, and thank you for all panelists for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, and the path forward on this issue. I think this was a very powerful conversation. We could have taken the whole week, not just a whole day or months. It's very complex, and this is just a voice from 4 people. There are so many Indigenous women, as Simone earlier explained, so many recognized and unrecognized Indigenous groups in the world. The main takeaway I would say is justice looks different for different groups. For some, it's law and the legal framework. For some, it's survival. For some, it's expanding access to the tribal courts. But the most important thing that both Ruchira and Rita said is we don't understand who the justice is for. So let's not forget what we are trying to accomplish here when we say justice, access to justice. We have to start, what do the women want? Faith beautifully explained that acknowledging what a person or a woman, a girl is going through by itself is one act of justice. She mentions Jessica repeatedly because Jessica was the one that gave her the platform to speak. So we've learned from the audience, from the panelists, that listening is one act of justice. Acknowledging the harm is one act of justice. And definitely from Rita's experience, we know by now war has never liberated any women, let alone Indigenous women. War has not helped Tigrayans, Europeans in Tigray. War has not helped Sudanese Indigenous women, the Darfuris, the Nubians in Sudan. War has not helped the Palestinian women, and war is not going to help the Kurdish women. But overall, when we talk about access to justice from Rita's perspective, it is securing peace, securing safety and dignity after conflict and displacement, or overall avoiding it. And yeah, we look forward to having more conversations on this. And if anyone wants to be in touch with the panelists, we'll be happy to connect you. But yes, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Miigwech.
And for those who are here physically, we can continue the information sharing and the strategizing over a delicious lunch that Covington and Burling has provided us. I'm not sure exactly, it's right behind that glass wall. We'll figure out a way to get to it, but please feel free to stay and have lunch with us. And thank you so much, everyone, online and in person.